I'm John McQuay with 8541 Tactical, and this is Mail Call Mondays, the show that answers your questions about precision rifles, optics, and equipment. Well, this Monday we are going to talk about Remington 700 triggers. I've taken quite some time before I've actually decided to cover this topic. Remington recently did a recall of all Exmark Pro triggers from 2006 to current. So we're going to talk a little bit about that, and then we're going to talk about some of the different variants of Remington factory triggers and some of the aftermarket options that are out there. Now, first of all, if you have a rifle that you think may be part of the recall, and that will be a rifle that was delivered to you between 2006 and 2014, then you can go to Remington's website, plug in the serial number on your rifle, and they will tell you if it's part of the recall and how you need to go about that. And we will leave a link to that down in the description below, so make sure you check that out because you definitely want to know if your rifle is part of the recall or not. Now, what triggers are covered in the recall? Well, that is Remington's Exmark Pro trigger, and I haven't been able to line out because of the serial number thing if it is simply the Exmark Pro or if it includes the Exmark Pro adjustable as well. My gut would tell me it's probably the Exmark Pro adjustable as well, since they use a very similar process and the adjustment screws are sealed in the same way. Now, what I've been able to discern is the reason for the recall is when Remington sets their triggers at the factory, they use this goo on them, this adhesive, to seal the adjustment screws. And the adhesive that they use, it's kind of a lot like fingernail polish. That's what we use after we adjust them, is we cover them with fingernail polish. But apparently somebody got a little bit crazy with the glue, and there may be excess glue inside the trigger mechanism. That excess glue inside the trigger mechanism could cause the trigger to fail in a manner that would allow the weapon to fire. I have not actually heard of any documented cases of this occurring with the new Exmark triggers. It's actually kind of ironic because the Exmark triggers were created in order to solve the fire off safe condition that occurred with the old Walker triggers. Now, this is an old Walker trigger that I have here, also referred to as a pre-2006 trigger because they were the predecessor to the Exmark triggers. Now, a little bit of discussion about the difference between these triggers. Now, there's a ton of external differences on them, a ton of material differences on them. The old Walker triggers are fairly elegant in design. They're pretty tough triggers. The new ones feel a little bit cheaper, and they have a lot of extra pieces and springs and all kinds of stuff on them. On the original Walker triggers, when you place your weapon on safe, what happens is the safety lever cams up and it will actually support the sear up here, which is what's holding the cocking piece back on the bolt. When you place the weapon on fire, it releases that sear, and then the trigger is what is holding the sear back, keeping the weapon from firing. The failures that were occurring with the Walker triggers is when you get all kinds of nastiness down in here, deer blood, hair, rust, WD-40, stuff that is not supposed to be inside a trigger mechanism, then it could cause this trigger to freeze to the rear while the weapon is on safe. Well, if you're one of these guys that likes to keep a weapon loaded on safe, sitting in the corner for years, well, if that trigger seizes to the rear for whatever reason, then you go place the weapon on fire. Well, the trigger is not in a place where it can support that sear. The only thing that's supporting the sear is the safety lever. When you flip the safety lever onto fire, that is basically like pulling the trigger on the rifle because you are now removing the only mechanism that's supporting the sear. The sear would drop, the striker would go forward and light the round off. A lot of the Remington issues that were covered in the CNBC hit piece, which I think was very poorly done, had a definite spin to it. A lot of the instances there were a failure of the firearm safety commandments. The weapon was not pointed in a safe direction. It was not treated as if it were loaded, and the shooter would place the weapon on fire in order to unload the rifle. Now that brings us to the original failing of the Walker trigger, and I have an action here that has a Walker trigger installed in it. The original trigger When the safety was on, as it is here, safety to the rear, it would lock the bolt handle in the closed position, so you could not unload the rifle without placing the rifle on fire. Now again, if the trigger was gummed up, if you had all kinds of garbage in there and the actual trigger itself was stuck to the rear, when you placed it on fire in order to unload your rifle, immediately placing it on fire would cause the rifle to fire. It would cause the rifle to discharge. So Remington's solution to that originally was to have shooters send their rifles in with the old trigger, and they would just simply cut off this bar that pivoted up to block the bolt. Now that was not a concern on rifles after that initial recall, because they changed the leg on the safety lever so that it could no longer pivot up and lock the bolt. They also removed the cutout in the bottom of the bolt that little leg engaged. So even if you had a modern rifle and installed an old trigger that still had the leg on it, that wouldn't work. You couldn't actually block the bolt. This trigger that I have right here is actually one of the original triggers that still had the leg on it when I got the trigger. And I just simply pulled the safety lever off, took a Dremel, cut off that leg, re-blued it, put everything back together, and this has been a very, very good trigger for me. It is now sitting here because I replaced it with a Timney 510. Now, after all the problems with the Walker triggers, Remington decided, okay, we need to totally redesign this trigger. And the result was the Exmark Trigger. The Exmark Trigger is a trigger blocking safety. When you apply the safety on the Exmark Trigger, it prevents the trigger itself from moving. It pins it in place. So the trigger is still supporting the sear, but it can't move to the rear when the safety is engaged. So it prevents the trigger from getting mashed out of position, sticking out of position, and then getting the fire on safe or fire off safe condition that you had with the Walkers, which I thought was a really good idea. The unfortunate thing is Remington has to try to accommodate people that don't care for their weapons the way they should, that will get in there and monkey around with stuff and cause all kinds of other issues. Now, another big problem that we run into is people that try to adjust these triggers on their own. The original Walker triggers were extremely easy to adjust. They actually have flathead screws for their adjustment points. So once you peel the adhesive off, which was pretty easy to do with a flat blade screwdriver, you just chip the adhesive off, and then you can turn the screws and you have full control over travel, sear engagement, and pull weight. Well, what guys would do is they'd try to get the crispest trigger they could, and so they'd crank that sear engagement down really far so that there's only less than the width of a human hair holding that striker back. And you'd thump that rifle and you'd have a discharge. So they, I guess, attempted to solve some of that with the new triggers. Also with the old triggers, you could dial the pull weight down fairly far. If you went in and started changing spring rates too, which was also fairly easy because it's just a simple coil spring, you could get the pull weight on these triggers down fairly far. With the Exmark trigger, they increased the pull weight. The pull weights from the factory are really 5 pounds and up. Most of the ones I've gotten are around 5.5 pounds from the factory. They made it a little bit more difficult to adjust. They kind of changed the location slightly on some of the adjustments. They use Allen head set screws in the adjustment points now, and they really goobered them up with sealant. So all in an effort to try to help prevent you from monkeying with the trigger. Remington does not even allow Remington certified armorers to adjust the trigger. As a Remington certified armorer, if I had to replace the trigger in a Remington 700, then what I have to do is contact the factory. They send me a complete trigger mechanism. I punch out the pins, drop the new trigger mechanism in. I'm not allowed to touch the adjustments on the trigger at all. If I do, Remington does not indemnify any of the work that I've done. So you're not allowed to do any of that stuff. The triggers, I've adjusted a couple of Exmark triggers on my personal rifles, not in a capacity as a Remington armorer, and the adjustments generally do not hold very well. They have a tendency to creep a little bit, and I'm not exactly sure why they're doing that. I don't know if it's the spring rates. I don't know if the springs have taken a set in it and they're changing a little bit, or if it's just the geometry inside the trigger that doesn't support a really nice lightweight trigger pull. I think it's a trigger by trigger thing, because I have had other Exmark triggers, the one on Sarah's rifle particularly, that I've got a really nice 3.5 pound trigger pull on it, and it has stayed consistent. It's stayed right where it needs to be, so we haven't really messed with the trigger on that rifle. So they tend to be a little bit inconsistent, and that again may just be the manufacturing tolerances inside of them. But again, it appears that we now have a problem with the Exmark triggers, so make sure you check yours. Now on the Exmark triggers, there are really two different variants that we come across in the wild. There's the Exmark, which has a smooth trigger here, and then there's the Exmark adjustable. They're both referred to as the Exmark Pro. But the Exmark adjustable that has a set screw in the upper end of the trigger bow that is supposed to give you some adjustability on the trigger pull weight. I'm going to tell you, it really doesn't. You would have to get in there and mess with some stuff. We got this one on our, I think this one came on the SPS Tactical AAC-SD project rifle, and messing with the set screw in the trigger really did not change the pull weight measurably at all. So that really was not a great addition to these triggers. One problem that it did cause in some triggers is you've got this hole right in the middle of the point where the trigger receives the most pressure, and that hole is threaded, so you have stress risers in there. And there actually have been some of these triggers that have broken right here at the set screw. So you need to keep that in mind with the Exmark Pro adjustable trigger. If you have an Exmark Pro adjustable trigger, I would recommend just getting rid of that and putting in a replacement Timney 510 trigger. Now, I'm going to tell you, just to cover my own liability, I can't recommend that you put an old Walker trigger in a current rifle to replace a Exmark trigger. I'm not willing to risk my family's livelihood, my house, my future income on telling you to do that. I will tell you, there are a lot of people who have replaced the new Exmarks with an older Walker trigger, and that's one of the reasons it's getting harder and harder to find these guys. Remington there for a while would include the old Walker triggers on some custom shop guns, and they also included them on military contract rifles. I believe some of the military contract rifles are still using the Walker triggers. There are some new triggers for SOCOM and that we'll talk about here in a minute, but the Walker trigger is still floating around. If you decide to do that replacement, just know that this trigger has a lot of stigma floating around it. So if you ever sell the rifle to somebody and they have a problem with it, it may come back to bite you. I'm not a lawyer. I don't know if you guys maybe mistook me for one and all the other stuff that I do. So this is not legal advice. I would suggest that if you decide to sell a rifle that you have taken an Exmark out of and put a Walker trigger in, that you talk to a lawyer about the possible liability concerns on that. And I would probably suggest putting the original trigger back in it before you sell that rifle. If you decide to replace the Exmark trigger, which because of the recall a lot of people have, a trigger I can definitely recommend that is at a great price point is the Timney 510 and Timney 517 triggers. I've got one of the Timney 510s in one of my other rifles. It's got quite a few rounds through it, and I've never had a problem with it. It's a very crisp, very nice feeling trigger. I just recently bumped that trigger pull weight back to about 2.5 pounds on it. Still works very, very well, feels great. The Timney 510 is a fully adjustable trigger. You get the same adjustments that you had on the Walker trigger. You have pull weight, over travel, and sear engagement. So you've got all that ability to dial that stuff in. Furthermore, you can order these triggers from Timney pre-adjusted at the factory to the pull weight that you desire. The one that I have right here is a Timney 517. It has a straight trigger bow. The Timney 510s have a traditional curved bow. Now the Timney 510 has a very wide trigger bow, and what I just recently realized when I swapped a configuration around is it just barely fits through the bottom metal in a Surgeon magazine system. So you might want to be aware of that. Now on the Timney 517, it is just slightly wider, almost exactly the same width. With the bevels on the side of it, it's just slightly wider than the original Walker trigger. So you shouldn't have a problem if you're installing a 517. What you may encounter though is because the trigger bow is straight, it may interfere with the bottom of your trigger guard. Now of course, if you have a problem like that, it'd be fairly simple to sand down the bottom of this trigger so that you don't have any clearance problems. And that is a whole lot easier than trying to machine the sides of the trigger to be thinner. So think about the 517 if you're going with something like Surgeon bottom metal or something that you may have some clearance issues with. Again, very nice. It is a single stage trigger just like the original factory trigger. Now, some of you guys out there have asked me on the recall if you should just go ahead and replace the trigger or if you should send your rifle to Remington. I'm going to tell you right now, if your trigger, your Exmark trigger, functions perfectly and you have it dialed in exactly where you want it to a nice light pull weight, it works fine for you, you're going to have to do some soul searching and decide if you want to send it in or not, because they are going to pull that trigger off, they're going to replace it with a different trigger, they're not going to adjust it down to your super lightweight trigger pull. It's probably going to come back with a lawyer-friendly heavy trigger pull on it, and you'll have to go through the whole process over again. Now, I can't in good faith tell you not to send your rifle back in on a recall because, again, that is a liability concern. However, if you no longer have the Exmark trigger on your rifle, then there is no reason to send your rifle in because no other portion of the rifle is affected. It's just simply that trigger mechanism itself. Some of you guys have also asked me if you should just replace your trigger anyway. Well, I can tell you that the wait to replace your trigger on your Remington or to send it in and have it replaced on the recall is fairly significant right now by all reports that I'm hearing. Even with some law enforcement guns, there may be some time. Now, it all depends on if you're sending it back to Remington or if you're sending it to a regional service center. Regional service center times may be slightly different. If you're lucky enough to live really close to a service center that can get in and do a carry in, carry out, then you may think about just going ahead and having that fixed anyway so that it's marked down in their books that it's been fixed under the recall. You can rightly say that you have the rifle fixed under the recall and then do whatever you want to do with it after the fact. Now, for you guys that don't want to wait, replacing your trigger really may be a viable option. I know in my case, I probably would not send a rifle in. I actually have several of them that are under recall, but none of them have the original factory Remington trigger. I would consider just replacing it with a Timney 510 or Timney 517 if you're on a budget constraint, or the other trigger we're getting ready to talk about here in a minute if you're not constrained by your budgets. That will solve the problem. That will keep you from being without your rifle. Now, we're not set up here to actually do a trigger install video, but I will tell you really quickly, it is really about as easy as you can get. It's one of the easiest operations that you can do on a Remington 700, and you'll notice that you have two pins. You may be able to see it better from this side. You have two pins holding your trigger in. That's the only thing holding the trigger on the bottom of the rifle. So what you need to do is you need to place the rifle on fire, remove your bolt, make sure the rifle's unloaded, of course. Then this is key. Place the rifle on safe. Make sure the rifle is on safe because that safety lever will cover these pins. Now you're going to come from the left-hand side and you're going to drive first the rear pin out. You're going to drive it out from the left to the right. So if you have the rifle on fire, that safety lever is going to interfere. The pin is going to impact the back of the safety lever. And if you're wailing away with a hammer, you'll bend that safety lever out. If you're just ditching the Remington factory trigger for a Timney, then that may not be an issue. You may not need to keep the pieces. But if you're intending to keep that safety lever and transfer it over to a different trigger, then you need to make sure that you keep that intact. Now, one thing to bear in mind before you start driving this pin out is there is a spring in the bottom here holding your bolt stop in. You want to take a look at that and make sure that you understand the way the spring sits on the pin and on the bolt stop. In fact, I would recommend that you bust out your cell phone or bust out your camera and snap some photos of the way that spring goes in, because that is the biggest hang up when we put things back together. If you know the way it goes in, it goes back together very fast. If you don't know the way it goes in, you can spend some hours trying to get that orientation right and getting it stuck back in there. Once you punch that rear pin out, your bolt stop lever will come off, the bolt stop spring will come off, and the trigger will want to pivot. Now there is a spring underneath your sear, so if you let that trigger swing down, that spring is going to go flying, it's going to roll across the bench, and you'll probably lose it. So make sure you hold the sear down when you pivot the trigger out. Next, you're going to just punch out the forward pin, and as soon as that forward pin clears, you don't even have to punch it all the way out, just punch it out far enough to get the trigger out. You can drop that trigger out and you're good to go. Take your new trigger, you're just going to stick it in there, drive that front pin through, swing it back into place, and you're going to line up your rear pin, get your rear pin through, and I will usually drive the pins back from the right to the left because I can get the pin most of the way through, then line up my bolt stop and bolt stop spring and tap it the rest of the way through, and it really saves you from having to have 4 or 5 different hands. There's usually a bevel on the pins, so make sure you have the bevel on the right hand side. That's the way it's supposed to go when you're putting it together. If not, if you want to do it the opposite direction, then you need to go ahead and put your bolt stop and your bolt stop spring lined up, tap that pin in to begin, then put your trigger in and drive the pin the rest of the way through. Hopefully at some point here in the next week or two, we will do a trigger install on a receiver, and we'll actually show you some close-ups of how we're doing it. We're trying to get this video done quickly here this week so I don't have time to set up the B camera and really get you some tight-end shots. But we'll work on that later. Now, a real quick comment on the safety lever. On the triggers, the Timney 510 and Timney 517, they come with a safety lever installed. It's a totally different safety lever than the factory Remington triggers. So if you are replacing an Exmark trigger, you need to get a trigger that includes its own safety lever, because as far as I am aware, no aftermarket triggers out there utilize the same lever that comes on your Exmark trigger. So if you get a Jewel or something else that uses the factory safety lever, and I'm just throwing that out there, I can't remember if the Jewel does or not, then you are going to need to either try to order an old Remington safety lever, which I don't even believe you can do, or you're just going to be SOL. A lot of bench rest guns, they don't even use safety levers because the only time the gun is loaded is when it's bagged in, facing down range, getting ready to fire. So keep that in mind. If you're replacing the Exmark, you will need a complete trigger with the lever. And nicely, the triggers here, the Timney 510 and 517, also come with your bolt release already on the trigger, so you don't have to mess with switching the bolt release over either. Now, if you want to go a little high end, a lot of guys have asked me about this, and go with a 2-stage trigger. We just got a CG Extreme Shooting Products Mod 22 trigger in. This is a 2-stage trigger for the Remington 700. This trigger was actually set up and went through the SOCOM contract, the PSR contract, and we'll have a whole lot more information on this trigger once we get some time to install it, get it on the rifle, and start working with it. Just getting it out of the package, this is a beefy trigger. This is really a tank of a trigger. It's got some weight to it. It comes with the safety lever already on it. And as I said, it is a fully adjustable 2-stage trigger. You can adjust the distance and the weight on the first stage, you can adjust the weight on the second stage, and you can adjust the sear engagement on the trigger. So you can pretty much adjust everything about it. This is their tactical model, so it does have the standard trigger shoe that is part of the trigger itself. They have another more competition-oriented model that has a rod and takes Anschutz style triggers, so you can swap whatever trigger shoe you want onto the trigger. I think this is better suited for a working rifle or for a competition rifle, the competitions that we do, precision rifle / tactical rifle competitions. This is another option for replacing your trigger. This is one of the few two-stage Remington triggers out there. The Huber is the other one. Unfortunately, at this point, I don't have any experience with the Huber, so I can't comment on that. But I've gotten some good reports so far on this trigger, and we're going to get it on a rifle and get it out and put a couple hundred rounds on it, and we'll see how well it works and how well I like this two-stage. Now, two-stage triggers are really a personal preference thing. On precision gas guns, I prefer a two-stage trigger because there's less of a chance of doubling on that gun. If you get a really short take-up, really short release, really lightweight single-stage trigger on a heavy recoiling 308, 260, etc. gas gun, then you can run into doubling issues, and that's really not a good thing. With a two-stage trigger, since you have a long take-up, then there is very, very little chance of doubling, which is firing 2 shots when you only intended to fire 1 shot. So two-stage triggers on a precision gas gun are my preference. On bolt guns, really either way works well, but on a working gun, what I find is that with a two-stage trigger, like the trigger that we have on our Accuracy International AE Mark II, with that long take-up, then you can really be sure that you are wanting to send a bullet fly before you hit that first stage and release the shot. The reason I really like 2 stages on a working gun is you don't get to decide when you're going out, when you're going to set up, and when you may have to take a shot. It may be freezing cold, it may be raining. You may have lost some of the feeling and some of the dexterity in your hand by the time it comes time to actually need to take the shot. So an 8-ounce single-stage trigger would be a very, very bad idea on a working rifle. Once those digits get cold, it may be difficult to tell how far you've indexed that trigger. So with a 2-stage trigger, even if you're wearing heavy gloves that have some padding in them, when you take that first stage, or when you take the first stage back, then you're compressing that padding and you're getting a feel for the trigger, and you feel the trigger move, so you know without a question you've engaged the trigger and you're getting ready to fire the shot. Then when you hit the wall, you press further, you press through the second stage, and the shot goes. So on working rifles, I really do prefer a 2-stage trigger. Now, all the Remington 700s I use for any kind of competition shooting right now have single-stage triggers on them. That's why I was very, very excited that X-Treme Shooting Products sent us out their new trigger, especially since it was part of the SOCOM PSR competition. So I will definitely get that trigger out, get some more trigger time on it, and then come back and report back to you guys how well that one worked. You can leave me whatever comments you want or questions you have on this trigger down in the comments section below, or send them to me on Facebook or Twitter, and I will get to them as soon as I actually have some information, or probably we will just answer them when we do the review. That is kind of a middle-of-the-road, somewhat broad review or overview of the different triggers right now for the Remington 700. There are a ton of different triggers out there. One thing I'll say real quick, jewel triggers. A lot of guys want to know about jewel triggers because they're in use a lot in some of the bench rest competitions. Jewel triggers, when they're clean, seem to work very well, have a very high quality trigger pull. When they get dirty, they tend to fail. I've seen quite a few jewel triggers fail in competition. So really, I would suggest staying away from the jewels unless you're in a very clean environment and you're very good about cleaning your trigger mechanism out after regular range trips. The Timney Calvin Elite, I have not gotten any trigger time on yet. I don't have one here in the shop. It gets very high praise from some competition shooters, but I've also know of at least one competition shooter that had quite a few of them go down. So I'm not sure where exactly the Timney Calvin Elite ranks. I know you can get a very light very high quality trigger pull on it. We have a couple of guys at our local club that are running the Timney Calvin Elites in the 8-ounce range on their rifles. I still have my own opinions on trigger pulls that light on a precision rifle / tactical rifle competition gun. I still think I really want triggers more closer to the 2.5, 3.5 pound range. I think 2.5 is really starting to get to the bottom edge of where you want that to be. So that's a decision that you have to make on your own. On cleaning these triggers, on any of the triggers that I've mentioned here, first of all, you're always safe by going with the manufacturer's recommendations. On the original Remington triggers, the Walker and the Exmark triggers, what I recommend to clean them is Zippo lighter fluid. Don't put any oil, don't put any WD-40, definitely not WD-40 because that will gum up the trigger very quickly. If you need to clean out your trigger, then just take a can of Zippo lighter fluid, take it out to where you've got a good place, good ventilation, where that lighter fluid can evaporate, and just hose the trigger from top down with that lighter fluid. Make sure you have it out of the chassis or out of the stock because you don't want lighter fluid collecting in there, and you don't want the lighter fluid to soften the bedding in your stock if you have a glass bedded stock. So pull the action out, just hose that trigger out with lighter fluid. The advantage of the Zippo fluid is it has very few extra additives in it. There's very low chance of that varnishing up the trigger. And it is a petroleum product that will leave just the bare minimum of lubrication in that trigger when you're done. That's an old school trick that goes way, way back, and it still works very well. The metal in the triggers hasn't changed from back when that originally started. So lighter fluid is a great option to clean out the very detailed, very fine mechanism in that trigger. That's really about all that I have for you guys this week. I hope you've enjoyed the show, and if you have, please make sure you like, share, and subscribe. If you have any questions or comments, leave them in the comment section below or send them to us on Facebook or Twitter. And until next time, get out and shoot! And for those of you that have stuck around after the bumper, you know what this is. This is the Mega Arms Ma-10 Megalithic receiver set, and I am happy to report that we are waiting on the last part for our megalithic build. We actually have our buttstock, we've got our trigger assembly in. I just got the tracking on the barrel and the bolt carrier group, and we have just talked to SLR Rifle Works, and they are sending us an adjustable gas block for this setup. So that is pretty much everything we need to go ahead and assemble this rifle and get on with our Mega Ma-10 build series. We have decided to go ahead and do this in 6.5 Creedmoor, and there's a couple of reasons that we decided to go with 6.5 Creedmoor. First of all, 260 is really getting on the long side for the PMags. Magpul PMags are what we like to use in these, and you really end up pushing that bullet back in the case a little bit when you're running the PMags. Hopefully we'll be able to get a little bit better with the 6.5 Creedmoor. Also, I just don't have a 6.5 Creedmoor rifle in the inventory, and really the ballistics between 6.5 Creedmoor and 260 are identical. It's not really that much of a difference, but we're going to experiment with what we can do with that 6.5 in the Ma-10. If we're building another bolt rifle, I'd probably stick with 260 because it saves me on the logistical side of things. I don't have to worry about an extra set of dies. I don't have to worry about different brass. But with the gas gun, we decided to go with 6.5 Creedmoor mainly because 6.5 Creedmoor was designed for gas guns. So we'll see how that goes. We will get our parts in, we'll get everything organized, and then we will start shooting this build. I definitely want to thank Mega Arms for sending us out the megalithic receiver set. Without their support, it would be very, very difficult for us to do this. When we do these builds, there's a lot of money wrapped up into them, so any manufacturer support that we can get definitely helps out. I will save the information on what specific barrel we're going with until we actually start shooting the series. Same thing on the buttstock. I got to leave you guys something to look forward to. We are going to run this as a long barrel precision rig though. When we did the Mega Arms monolithic build, we went with a shorter gun. We went with the 16-inch 308 build, and that was more designed like a LEDM rifle. I actually took that out and shot the Woody's Designated Marksman match with it and had an absolute blast with it. This one is definitely going to be designed as a long gun. I really hope to get it built up and to see if we can get this thing to run head-to-head with bolt guns. I'd love to be able to have a semi-automatic rifle that I can take out to most precision rifle competitions and be able to actually have it run with the big dogs. So we will see what our end result is. Overall, I can't say enough about the fit and finish of this receiver. It really is beautiful to behold. It is absolutely perfectly machined. I can't pick on it at all, and I really try to find things to pick at on these. So you definitely will want to stay tuned and see the full build series on this, and that will be coming up. Give me probably about a month and a half to get it done at the most. We may start just chunking it out as quickly as we can, but we again have some other projects in the works that we need to get out as well as this. So no promise on the timeline. We will get it out as we can get it out, but you have that to look forward to. That's coming up. So stay tuned, and thank you guys for watching.